Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Kress. I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. Thanks for tuning in this morning. It's my pleasure to be here. And first of all, I'd like to begin by apologizing for the audio quality this morning. A little problem with Skype. It's my usual call-in method, so we're on the telephone this morning. My apologies, and endure with us until we can fix the problem. We're continuing our reading and discussion of the book, The Vatican Billions, and we have the injection of this man by the name of Michel Sindona, the Vatican's banker. And we're going to be talking about massive bank scandals by the Roman Catholic Church through Sindona and the Vatican Bank, Bishop Marcinkus. And we'll take our time with this and digest it as best we can. But learn. It is important for us to learn what the Roman Catholic Church is all about and what her strategies are with regard to mammon, money, and worldly possessions and riches. It is not the Church of Jesus Christ. It is the Church of Antichrist. Now, if you're following along in the book, I'm at the top of page 218. The author writes that dilemmas with which occasionally the Vatican was faced were varied and many. For example, it so happened that once the Vatican found itself consorting with some notorious Marxist bedfellows. These had managed to establish themselves within the board of the Vatican's own controlled Banca Unione. Amongst others, the rabid revolutionary family of the Feltrinelli publishers, whose founder, not long afterwards, blew himself up when attempting to plant dynamite against a high-voltage electric pylon outside of Milan, while, so it was said, trying to carry out a daring act of sabotage against the establishment. The bedfellowship had made the Vatican increasingly uneasy. The problem was put to Michel Sindona. Sindona bought the bank and ousted the offending bedfellow at once. It had been as easy as that. Sindona, however, had caught two birds with one stone. Since by freeing his Vatican's client from an impossible political nightmare, he had simultaneously made a very good deal for himself. Once under his control, the Banca Unione, until then a semi-dormant provincial bank, was suddenly revitalized. Sindona offered its investors double interest rates. The result was predictable. The Banca Unione's deposits rose from $70 to $165 million practically overnight. Sindona continued to operate with the aid of the Vatican. Like when, for instance, the head of the IOR, the Vatican Bank, Bishop Marcinkus, suggested to him that he should buy the Vatican's interest in La Centrale Finanziaria Generale and resell it to the Banco Ambrosiano of Milan, the focus of an impending scandal of the 80s. Or when Marcinkus convinced the Pope to compel the Patriarch of Venice to sell his controlling interest in the Banca Cattolica del Veneto, a local Venetian bank, to Sindona, who then resold it to the Banco Ambrosiano, where the Vatican had already substantial shares to partially control it. These and similar operations impressed not only the head of economic affairs for the Vatican, but also the Pope himself. The latter, the Pope, was so satisfied with Sindona that in one of his rare moments of enthusiasm, he called Sindona his, quote, very own financial fox, unquote. Sindona's fame spread in Italy and abroad. In the United States, David Kennedy, who had been president of the Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company of Chicago, considered Sindona a financial wizard. The importance of such a reputation can be judged by the fact that years later, Kennedy became Treasurer Secretary in the first cabinet of President Nixon, an invaluable political and social asset for Sindona. It was at this stage that the Vatican, harassed by Italy's threat to force it to pay tax on its holdings in the Italian stock market, and furthermore, to pay arrears and future taxation, decided to play it safe by transferring its money outside the country. To avoid taxes, the Vatican is moving her assets to the United States, putting them in the hands of Michele Sindona. And it says, like with the Banca Unione, Sindona was asked to help the church out of this matter, this ever-menacing nightmare. Sindona accepted under one condition. The Vatican had to help him to deal with Italy's biggest real estate and construction unit of the period, $175 million Società Generale Immobiliare. This was the same company which had built the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. for about $70 million, mostly with Vatican money. The Società, behind which there were very substantial Vatican shares, had built, via front companies, the Cavalieri Hotel, Hilton Hotel in Rome, and many other valuable constructions in Italy, the United States, and elsewhere. Sindona, true to his practice, bought out the controlling interest which the Vatican had in the Società and sold 16% to Gulf and Western Industries. Then, he kept 40% controlling interest for himself, giving 5% to his main client, the Vatican. The manner of disposing of the SGI by the latter is interesting insofar that it throws a light upon the Vatican-Sindona team strategy. Early in 1969 and 70, the Vatican declared, wishing to discharge the image of acting as a business concern, that it had sold its holdings in the SGI to Americans, meaning that it had no longer anything to do with the SGI itself. The Americans turned out to be the Gulf and Western Industries, the owner of Paramount Pictures Corporation, whose amount of shares in the Società had been so substantial that it practically controlled it. The key men behind the transaction, Charles B. Blundorn, the Gulf and Western Industries chairman, and Michael Sindona, the Vatican's financier-in-chief. By now, Sindona was acting not only for the Vatican, but also tangentially for the no less powerful concerns, enjoying by now the confidence of a growing number of American business companies, beginning with the Jesuit-controlled Bank of America, the Salonese Corporation, and other big U.S. bodies. To complete the transfer, Sindona acquired the 3.5% of the Societa's shares, which until then had been owned by the Assicurazione Generale. The Assicurazione, it should be noted, was yet another insurance company partially controlled by the Vatican via heavy acquisitions of shares. The Vatican is heavily invested in insurance, and that's why there's so much scandal involved in insurance companies. Now, continue, it says, thanks to such brilliant operations, Sindona was elected to the board of directors of the Società Generale Immobiliare itself. It was a vindication of his financial capabilities. His most secretive sponsor, the Vatican, and his U.S. supporters were delighted. Sindona became the favorite financier of sundry Catholic commercial quarters in the United States, from which he drew an unlimited amount of goodwill, protection, and funds. The Vatican, meanwhile, had become so pleased with him that it put at his disposal a unique team of international experts, composed of 18 top businessmen. Their task, to give Sindona professional advice. The importance of the offer can be judged by the fact that the team had been approved personally by the Pope himself. It was composed of individuals drawn from the very top of U.S. financial echelons. To mention only a few, John Bugis, Vice President of the Ford Motor Corporation, Vermont C. Royster, Senior Vice President of the Wall Street Journal, I.A. Farley, former Postmaster General of the United States, Martin R. Gainsborough, Chief Economist of the United States National Industrial Conference Board. Supported by such a formidable all-American think tank and the blessing of the Pope, Sindona plunged headlong into quote-unquote business. The Vatican, of course, continued to remain his main sponsor, protector, and client. This meant that he was called in with even more urgency each time the IOR, the Vatican Bank, burdened with inconvenient shareholdings or real estate, was anxious to get rid of them without much fuss or embarrassing disclosures. To get quick results, very often Sindona used his own peculiar method. He bought whatever the Vatican didn't want. Whether the operation made Sindona the real buyer or was acting as a frontman for the Vatican did not bother anybody, beginning with the Vatican, as long as Sindona operated in her interests, the interests of the Roman Catholic Church. The Sindona phenomenon grew without relenting, so much so that around the 70s, Sindona had become indispensable to the Roman Catholic Church whenever she had to deal with major financial operations. Within a few years, thanks to his energy, the Vatican's portfolio not only grew by leaps and bounds as never before, it became greatly diversified with stocks of the most varied character. These went from Chase Manhattan Bank to Standard Oil, Celanese, Colgate, Unilever, General Foods, Procter & Gamble, Westinghouse, and the like. Simultaneously, the Vatican became involved, even if tangentially, with vast construction projects. For instance, that in which it substantially financed the $3,000 million scheme cooperating with concerns such as Eurus Building Corporation or Tisham Realty and Construction. It provided, listen to this, it provided also financial aid for the buildings of the New York World Trade Center. That's right, the Vatican heavily invested in the New York World Trade Center as a building project. Now, you don't suppose the Vatican had anything to do with the demolition of those buildings, do you? That's my assertion. That is my assertion. Knowing that during 9/11, the President of the United States was a member of Skull and Bones, which I refer to as a Knight of the Most Holy Eucharist. Some would dispute that, but I've looked into it, and a Knight of Eulogia is the same as the Knight of the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is the great sacrifice of the Roman Catholic Church. They call it the Most Holy Eucharist. Donald Rumsfeld, Department of Defense Secretary, was a high-level Freemason. And the CIA director at that time was George J. Tenet, a Knight of Malta, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is run by the Knights of Malta. Dick Cheney, heavily involved with the Council on Foreign Relations. Condoleezza Rice, the State Department, graduate of Roman Catholic Notre Dame University, and Rudy Giuliani, a Knight of Malta, devout Roman Catholic. The principal players in our government at the time of 9/11 were devout Roman Catholics, and they served the Council on Foreign Relations. They served the papacy. 9/11 was an inside job. Osama bin Laden had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. Our own government did it. Our own Roman Catholic government did it. And it was the Vatican that heavily financed the construction of the building. The World Trade Center, it says it provided also financial aid for the buildings of the New York World Trade Center. Now, continuing, it says the relentless and often dubious Sindona operations created widespread suspicions and ultimate animosity. The Bank of Italy, its main spearhead, led the campaign. The Hambros Merchant Bank of London severed their connections, as did many other financial bodies. Sindona, faced with growing general ostracism, decided to shift his ground of operations and to transfer himself lock, stock, and barrel to the United States. Interesting. To be closer to the Pope's investments and to get out of trouble in Europe and Italy. Now, this is chapter 29. It's entitled The Church, Nixon, the Freemasons, and the Jailed Vatican Wizard. We're throwing Freemasonry into the mix, particularly that of the P2 Lodge. Now, before taking the fateful decision to go for good to the United States of America, Sindona consulted his two most powerful friends in Rome, the director of the Vatican Bank and the Pope. The men gave him their blessing, plus secretive recommendations to top American bankers and businessmen, a brilliant mixture of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and agnostics. It was agreed that Sindona would continue to act as the Vatican's chief financial advisor, but in secret. Sindona promised he would do his usual best as successfully as he had already done in Europe. Thereupon, having established himself in New York City, he began operations. His first steps had already been taken, the early purchase of 3 companies, the Oxford Electric, Interphoto, and Angus Incorporated. In 1972, he bought 52% interest, that is 1.6 million shares, in Talcott National for $27.3 million, and 21.6% interest in the Franklin New York Corporation, the holding company for Franklin National Bank. 1 million shares at $40 a share when it was selling at $32. After that, having done further subsidiary profitable coups on the side, he promptly donated $1 million to the 1972 Nixon campaign funds. There's a connection between the Roman Catholic Church and President Nixon. It says most of the funds, it was believed, came from the Vatican's bank. The rest came from Sindona and from the secret purse of members of the Freemasonic Brotherhood of Italy, which had special bonds with prominent lodges in the United States. Now, I assert there's a direct connection between the P2 Lodge and certain Masonic lodges in this country. Let me just be more specific. Scottish Rite Freemasonry at the top is Jesuit, controlled by the Jesuits. And we'll go into this further in succeeding broadcasts. I may even have other experts on the subject come and speak about it. But Freemasonry at the top is controlled by the Jesuit order. So is P2 Lodge, as we're going to see more evidence as we continue the reading here. It says the offer was refused because a recent law had made secret contributions to political parties illegal. There was more practical political considerations to it, however, than mere moral rectitude. At that particular period, these had become of paramount importance, since clandestineness might have backfired against both those who gave and those who had received. It's worth recording that since then, open contributions to political parties in the United States have reached monstrous proportions. a state of affairs as worthy of condemnation as clandestine subsidies used to be before they became illegal. Within one decade, from 1972 to 1982, for instance, 10 Republican senators re-elected in 1982 spent an average of about $1.7 million, more than 5 times what they had spent back in 1976. The Democrats were not far behind, with $1.4 million each. Sindona's single million, when seen retrospectively, therefore, seems child's play if compared to the fact that only 10 years later, the House and the Senate candidates spent about $300 million, over 25% more than they had spent only 2 years before in 1980. Another public interest lobby reckoned that it would double altogether by 1984. Such figures are only the tip of the iceberg, since beneath the permissible contributions, secret funds used for political promotion, although still illegal, have continued to pour into the coffers of the political machine, feeding political factions at a local and federal level far more efficiently than they did when Sindona and the Vatican Bank tried to feed the Nixon campaign. Hang on a second here. We'll see if we can switch back over to Skype for the audio.
Now, it says within one decade, from 1972 to 1982, for instance, 10 Republican senators re-elected in 1982 spent an average of $1.7 million, more than 5 times what they spent back in 1976. The Democrats were not far behind with $1.4 million each. Sindona's single million, when seen retrospectively, therefore, seems child's play if compared to the fact that only 10 years earlier, the House and Senate candidates spent about $300 million, over 25% more than they had spent only 2 years before in 1980. Another public interest lobby reckoned that it would double altogether by 1984. Such figures are only the tip of the iceberg, since beneath the permissible contributions, secret funds used for political promotion, although still illegal, have continued to pour into the coffers of the political machine, feeding political factions at a local and federal level far more efficiently than they did when Sindona and the Vatican Bank tried to feed the Nixon campaign. Now, continuing the book, The Vatican Billions by Avro Manhattan, he says the reticence of the Nixon supporters in refusing the Sindona-Vatican offer had been prompted not only by political consideration, but also by the fear of an impending scandal, which, if permitted to burst into the open, might have affected the pendulum of the election, with the potential dislocation of a disturbed Catholic vote. Their apprehensions, and Lord, let's not miss the point, the Roman Catholic Church is first and foremost a political animal. It's world control that she wants, and she gets it through politics. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, the Bible says, and that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth, she does it through politics. She elects her own candidates for presidency of this country. The Vatican is heavily involved in politics. Washington is her apple. Now, continuing now, it says their apprehensions were justified, since years later, in 1980, an American court charged Sindona with having siphoned $45 million from the Franklin funds into an unauthorized venture, mostly back in Italy. Sindona's affairs, meanwhile, continued to go from strength to strength. His fame as a generous and daring financier grew. The financial community, impressed by his patrons, the Vatican and the Church, no less than by his positive success, began openly to esteem him. Everything was prospering. Sindona's future seemed assured. After all, he had managed to get the control, almost at one single stroke, so to speak, of the 20th largest bank in the United States. No mean achievement. Things were going smoothly when rumors had it that the bank had lost $39 million, it was said, because of unauthorized trading in foreign currencies. Sindona's various sponsors, the Vatican and the Italian-American Masonic lodges, the latter only tangentially interested in Sindona's marginal activities in the Franklin affair, became alarmed. They agreed to help. The mysterious IOR, that is the Vatican Bank, raised $30 million and loaned it to the endangered Franklin National Bank in New York. The rescuing operation was carried out in total secrecy. The efforts proved to be in vain. The crash came earlier than expected, and it could not have come at a worse moment. Since back in Italy, Sindona's own Banca Privata Italiana of Milan had already been liquidated because it had been rumored $300 million could not be accounted for. See, this master genius of financier for the Roman Catholic Church is a crook, which is not contrary to his client, I might add. Now, as a result of the latter, an arrest warrant had been issued on the grounds that Sindona had taken money from the Milan bank illegally. Furthermore, that he had faked the balance sheet to cover up the operation. An Italian court convicted Sindona on 25 counts of banking irregularities and sentenced him to 30 months in prison. But even more serious, it asked for his extradition, charging him with fraudulent bank manipulations. The charge, had he been apprehended, could have brought him at least 15 years in jail. While all this had been going on, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission accused Sindona with rules violations and filed a suit in federal court. Sindona was indicted on 66 counts of fraud connected with Franklin National's operations, the largest banking collapse to date in American history. Notwithstanding the disaster, he was set free on bail of $1,500,000 in August, when he promptly vanished. He came back in October. During the 2.5 months of his disappearance, Sindona, risking arrest, visited Europe. Remember, they were trying to extradite him back to Italy. He contacted the Vatican and pleaded for their help at his forthcoming trial in Manhattan's Federal District Court. Now, how do you suppose the Roman Catholic Church could help him in a federal district court? Remember the Vatican teaching that the civil courts must respond to the spiritual court in Rome. It's a subservient position, the federal district court. It's a secular court. And the judge of all the earth, the Pope, has power in the civil courts. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Now, the Vatican could not and would not become openly involved in the scandal. Heavens no, she has to appear, at least on the outside, to be, pristine. It's the Church of Christ, right? Bishop Marcinkus was vague and evasive. Undeterred, Sindona went to Frankfurt, Germany. There he had a secret encounter with the papal nuncio, Monsignor del Mestre, accredited to Bonn, Germany. The papal nuncio promised to help. He would lobby the top 3 financial bosses of the Vatican, he told him, 2 friends of his, Cardinal Gary, Cardinal Carpio, and even the reluctant Bishop Marcinkus. He would try to persuade them to stand by him in the American court. The 3 men agreed. Yes, they would vouch for Sindona's good character. To that end, they prepared a videotape to be used in court. When, however, federal judge Marvin Frankel went to Rome to collect it, that is the tape, he was forbidden to do so. The veto had come from none other than Cardinal Casseroli, the Vatican Secretary of State, second only to the Pope. It was obvious that Pope Wojtyła, we're talking about Pope John Paul II, many people don't know his last name, his real last name, it's pronounced Wojtyła. It was obvious that Pope Wojtyła was unwilling to risk embarrassing disclosures. And in parentheses, the author tells us that Pope Paul VI had died in 1978. Now, he, that is Pope John Paul II, was aware of the deep involvement which the IOR, the Vatican Bank, had had in prolonged disruptive adventures in Central America and the communist Poland, in which the CIA, which I call Catholics in Action, and the IOR, the Vatican Bank, had been heavily financial investors. That's right, the CIA, together with the Vatican Bank, were heavily invested in machinations in Central America and in Poland. We're talking about the Vatican-Washington alliance. And we'll get into that further when we get into the book, The Vatican-Washington-Moscow Alliance, by this same author, Avro Manhattan. And it says such disclosures would be of a most explosive nature and could become far more damaging to the Roman Catholic Church than any financial losses, no matter how heavy. Such a political scandal, unlike a financial one, might have endangered the cornerstone of the Pope's new alignment, the Vatican-Washington Alliance. That's a direct reference to a book that Avro Manhattan wrote on the subject. You know, there's a reason why the Bible calls the United States in Revelation chapter 13 the image of the beast. Because it is. The United States has become a virtual image of the Roman Catholic Church. It says, the better to justify the Vatican's apparent lack of concern in Sindona's collapse, it was then claimed that the Church had lost very little. Now they're resorting to lying, as if that were unusual for the Roman Catholic Church. It says, Bishop, now Archbishop Marcinkus, confirmed the claim. The loss had been amply compensated by profits made on previous deals with Sindona, he declared. Years later, 1982, Sindona himself agreed, quote, Marcinkus has earned at least $200,000 from me, he said. The Vatican did not lose one single dollar, unquote. Public opinion, however, continued to assess the Church's losses at about $60 million. Swiss experts disagreed. The Vatican had lost more than $250 million, they commented. Others, included American pundits, assessed the total loss of the Vatican-Sindona partnership at $750 million. Faced with the magnitude of such scandal, Marcinkus then declared to an incredulous world media, who knew how Sindona and he had been golf pals for years at the Aqua Santa golf club outside of Rome, that's the Holy Water golf club outside of Rome, that he, Archbishop Marcinkus, had met Sindona only once. Yet the true facts, disclosed again as late as 1982, were that during 1973, 1 year prior to Sindona's collapse, Marcinkus had been closely questioned by U.S. authorities in connection with counterfeit securities frauds believed to have been related to some of Sindona's operations when the IOR, the Vatican Bank, presided by Marcinkus, according to yet another source, had lost at least $80 million. Even more serious were rumors that the United States at one time had become convinced that the Vatican Bank had been part of a scheme meant to use about $900 million in counterfeit bonds. The rumors were never confirmed and no one was charged with the offending allegations, yet they persisted, and at one time they seemed to be so close to becoming positive accusations that the authorities had made ready even for official indictments. The charge, if proved, could have provoked a bombshell of such potency that its reverberations might have created reactions throughout the Catholic world, including the United States. The more so, since it appeared that the potential offenders were not only the Vatican Bank, but equally a cardinal second only to the Pope himself, Cardinal Tisserant, Dean of the Sacred College of Cardinals. Cardinal Tisserant was never accused of any offense since he died in 1972. How convenient, right? Yet the curious fact that he gave strict instructions that his diaries should be taken outside the Vatican immediately after his death revived the suspicions of his involvement in the counterfeit bonds. But if the fear of a major scandal had made the Vatican apprehensive, it had also frightened certain political elements inside the United States. The specter of a potential scattered Catholic vote scared the United States administration in office. Had the United States investigators pursued their trail, the Vatican scandal would have rocked not only the Vatican, but also the Roman Catholic Church in America, with results difficult to envisage in political and party terms. The investigation was stopped, by whom it was never divulged, although even at that time it had been whispered that it had been done at the instigation of Richard Nixon, pressured by a potent Catholic entourage and the counsel of an American cardinal and Jesuit friends. One of Nixon's main speechwriters during 3 whole years was a Jesuit father, the Reverend John McLaughlin, who wrote the Nixon speeches at a salary of $32,000 a year. Got Jesuits in the White House, and nothing has changed. The Jesuits still control the White House. Barack Obama's vice president is twice honored with Jesuit degrees, honorary degrees, devout Roman Catholic, and most of his cabinet is Catholic. Now, whether it was Nixon or someone else, the fact was that the investigation came mysteriously to an end. Too many interests of a financial and political nature were at stake. Too many people would have been hurt via the destabilization of the Catholic vote had the investigation been permitted to take its natural course. Can you imagine what would happen if a Protestant church were involved in these types of scandals, which isn't even possible? I mean, there's no single Protestant denomination. If they threw all their money together, they couldn't compare with the Vatican. But can you imagine the scandals that would arise in the so-called evangelical churches where they found to be as corrupt as we're seeing in this book? Now, he continues, but if the potential scandal of the counterfeit bonds was nipped in the bud, others, even if of minor dimensions, were not. The following year, in 1974, when the Sindona financial empire finally crashed, the Vatican Bank lost $50 million via speculations ascribed to an executive of the Banco di Roma per la Svizzera. The Banco's executive, who vehemently denied the charge, was later found mysteriously dead across the railway line. Officially presumed suicide, in effect, believed murdered. Cardinal Vanozzi, head of the Vatican's Prefecture of Economic Affairs, following speculation as to the Vatican's financial losses, declared that the Vatican's assets around the world at one time were still about $125 billion. As for the Vatican's relationship with Sindona, he then added that he had confined to the minimum the sale of the Società Generale Immobiliare. The true facts were otherwise. In February 1973, when the U.S. Stock Exchange stopped the trading in Vetco Industries, it came to light that 20% of the 27%, that is 454,000 shares worth $16 million, had been bought by the Vatican via the Liechtenstein Company, in which Sindona had had a substantial interest. After paying a fine to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Vatican sold all its Vetco shares at a profit. That was not all. The Vatican had also 22% equity participation, worth $19 to $20 million in Geneva's Finabank, the bank definancement, yet another of Sindona's banking operations. And the author offers a note here. He says, in 1975, the Swiss government closed the bank following large losses. Continuing, he says, also, Hamburg's Bankhaus Wolf, which controlled the Finabank, was closed following Sindona's Franklin crash. Sindona, meanwhile, following his disappearance act after his bail, was indicted on 66 counts of fraud. Having been taken to trial in 1980, he was found guilty on 65 charges and given a total of 25 years in prison. But if the Vatican did nothing to help its former financial advisor, the Freemasons of Italy and some of the United States did, or at least tried to. You think the Freemasons don't work for the Vatican? It's as a powerful lodge whose members could be found in the highest echelons in Italy and in America. Chief among these, the Lodge of Licio Gelli, P2, mobilized aid for their jailed brother, Michel Sindona. Called Propaganda Due, the lodge was an offshoot of the Orthodox Italian Freemasonry, whose main objective was to provide a clandestine base for the attainment of political power. Politics, Freemasonry, P2. And it says that the inner financial manipulators of the Vatican and Company could have had dealings, no matter how tenuous, with Masons, although a surprise to many Catholics, was not to the Vatican, who had long since accepted their existence in the United States because there in the United States, Masonry was quote-unquote different. Let me tell you what's different about Freemasonry in this country. It's run by the Jesuit order. It's one of the harlot daughters of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the difference, as a noted cynic explained, was the amount of money and, above all, political influence which they exerted in the highest financial and political circles of the United States itself, where Sindona, and thus the Vatican Bank, had been spinning their complicated financial webs. This had reached the most recondite nooks and crannies, not only of Italy, but also American life. The adversary of the leading political party, to whom Sindona and the Vatican had offered their $1 million fund contribution, was found to be involved, even if tangentially, with brother, quote-unquote brother, in reference to his Freemasonic membership, Michel Sindona himself, and thus by association with the Vatican. That was no idle speculation was proved by the fact that after the Grand Master Gelli's arrest, Licio Gelli, P2 Grand Master Licio Gelli's arrest, amongst his papers, there was found an exchange of letters between him and Philip A. Guarino, the chief of the American Republican National Committee. Their goal, to aid brother Michel, whose case in 1979 had looked somewhat hopeless. When in 1980, Sindona's case deteriorated even more following another list of additional frauds prepared against him, and the brothers of the lodge in Italy and in the United States had vainly hoped that somebody at the Vatican would help him, they complained bitterly that, quote, nobody's come to Michel's defense. Yet 2 weeks ago, wrote Chief of the American Republican National Committee, everything seemed to be going well, unquote. a reference to the efforts of the papal nuncio in Germany after he had promised to lobby the top cardinals connected with the Vatican Bank, as already seen, when the cardinals said that they would testify in favor of Michele Sindona. Quote, His Eminence, Cardinal Casaroli, the Secretary of State, forbade their eminences to do so, unquote, he ended. Quoting further, it says, nobody has come to his defense, he then concluded bitterly. Even the church has truly let him down, unquote. Guarino was right. The Vatican Secretary of State, who knew which way the wind of potential financial scandal was blowing, remember the inside information that the Vatican always has, as we shall see presently, tried to wash his hands of their former partner, the fallen, but still potentially dangerous, Michele Sindona. The ominous warnings of the oncoming new scandal were already there for all to see. In 1980 and 81, following additional investigations into the Sindona aftermath, the top senior executive of the IOR, that is the Vatican Bank, and his successor, were arrested. And we'll talk about it more tomorrow on the broadcast. Don't miss it. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on LibertyRadioLive.com. Are your eyes being opened? Stay with us. Tomorrow we'll continue.